The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Guard Captain James Mitchell began his routine security inspection. It was a Tuesday in late September, and the palace hummed with its usual quiet efficiency. Staff members moved through the corridors with practiced grace, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old carpets. Mitchell had served the royal family for 15 years, and he knew every corner of this magnificent building. Today felt like any other day, but fate had different plans. Mitchell's inspection route took him through the private quarters, areas rarely accessed by regular staff. He checked locks, examined security cameras, and verified that all protocols were being followed. His team of 6 guards accompanied him, their faces serious and professional. They moved through the East Wing methodically, room by room. Everything appeared normal until they reached a storage room near the Queen's former private chambers. The door was slightly ajar. Mitchell frowned. This particular room was supposed to remain locked at all times. It housed historical items and personal effects that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II. After her passing 3 years ago, the room had become something of a shrine, carefully maintained, but seldom entered. Mitchell pushed the door open slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. Inside, the room looked undisturbed at first glance. Glass display cases lined the walls containing photographs, letters, and various memorabilia. But Mitchell's trained eye caught something wrong immediately. One of the display cases was open. The velvet-lined interior, which should have held 3 pieces of Queen Elizabeth's personal jewelry collection, was empty. Mitchell's heart raced as he called for backup. Within minutes, senior security officials flooded the room. They cordoned off the area and began a thorough search. The missing items were no ordinary jewelry. They included a diamond brooch Queen Elizabeth had received on her wedding day, a pearl necklace gifted by her grandmother, and a sapphire ring she had worn at her coronation. Together, they were worth millions, but their sentimental value was immeasurable. The palace immediately went into lockdown. Every entrance and exit was secured. Staff members were questioned. Security footage was pulled from every camera in the building. The investigation was swift and thorough. Led by Mitchell himself and the palace's head of security, Margaret Chen. They worked through the afternoon, interviewing staff and reviewing hours of video footage. As evening approached, a junior security officer named Sarah Williams made a discovery that would shake the very foundations of the royal household. While searching the West Wing, an area housing offices and private residences for extended royal family members, she noticed something unusual. A storage closet that should have been locked was open. Inside, pushed far back behind cleaning supplies and old furniture, was a leather bag. Williams called Mitchell immediately. When he arrived and opened the bag, his face went pale. Inside were the 3 missing pieces of jewelry, wrapped carefully in soft cloth. But there was more. Also in the bag were several other items that appeared to be from the royal collection, including a small gold compact and a pair of antique earrings. These items had not been reported missing, which meant they had been taken without anyone noticing. The location of the discovery was significant. The storage closet was in a section of the palace used primarily by Tom Parker Bowles, the son of Queen Camilla. Tom maintained an office there, which he used occasionally when visiting his mother or attending royal events. He was not a working royal and spent most of his time at his own residence in London, but he had access to this part of the palace. Mitchell knew the implications immediately. This was not just a theft. This was a scandal that could damage the royal family's reputation severely. He contacted Margaret Chen, who in turn notified the king's private secretary. Within an hour, a meeting was called in the king's private study. Present were King Charles III, Queen Camilla, the king's private secretary, the head of palace security, and senior legal advisors. The mood in the study was tense. Queen Camilla sat very still, her face showing little emotion, but her hands trembled slightly as she listened to the security report. King Charles paced back and forth, his expression grave. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. The jewelry had been found in an area associated with Tom Parker Bowles. Security footage showed him entering that corridor 2 days earlier, though the cameras did not cover the specific closet where the bag was found. Tom Parker Bowles was immediately summoned to the palace. He arrived within an hour looking confused and worried. He was a successful food writer and critic, well known in his own right with no history of criminal behavior. The idea that he would steal from his own family seemed absurd, yet the evidence pointed directly at him. The initial questioning took place in a private room with only Mitchell, Chen, and one legal advisor present. Tom was cooperative but clearly shocked. He denied any knowledge of the jewelry or the bag. He admitted to being in that corridor 2 days ago, but only briefly to retrieve some documents from his office. He had not entered the storage closet and had no idea how the stolen items ended up there. As night fell over London, the palace was a fortress of secrets. Staff members whispered nervously in corners. Security guards stood at attention, their faces grim. Somewhere in the building, Queen Camilla sat alone in her private sitting room trying to comprehend how her son could be implicated in such a crime. The jewels that had belonged to the beloved Queen Elizabeth, now apparently stolen and hidden by her own stepson. The scandal, once it became public, would be devastating, but the night was far from over. As investigators continued to examine evidence and question staff, more questions than answers emerged. How had the jewelry been taken from a locked display case? Who else had access to that storage closet? And most importantly, if Tom Parker Bowles was innocent as he claimed, who was framing him and why? The palace turmoil had only just begun. The morning after the discovery brought no relief to the troubled palace. Tom Parker Bowles had spent the night in a guest room, essentially under house arrest, though no formal charges had been filed. He sat at the window, watching the early morning light spread across the palace gardens, his mind racing with confusion and fear. How could this be happening? He was a respected food critic and author, a father of 2 children, and a man who had always lived an honest life. In another wing of the palace, Margaret Chen worked through the night with her security team. They reviewed every piece of footage again, looking for something they might have missed. The timeline was becoming clearer, but it only raised more questions. The jewelry had disappeared from the display case sometime between Sunday evening and Monday morning. Tom had been at the palace on Monday afternoon, but the theft had already occurred by then. Chen called a meeting with her core team at 6 in the morning. Present were Captain Mitchell, Officer Williams, and 2 forensic specialists who had been brought in overnight. They spread out photographs, security logs, and timeline charts on a large conference table. Chen pointed to the critical gap in their evidence. The display case had been locked on Sunday evening during the regular security check. The next check was Monday morning when the theft was discovered. That left a 12-hour window. The forensic team had examined the display case thoroughly. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had taken the jewelry had used a key. Only 5 people in the entire palace had keys to that particular case. Chen read the list aloud. The king's private secretary, the head curator of the royal collection, the senior conservation officer, Margaret Chen herself, and one other person who had been granted access for inventory purposes 6 months ago. That person was Tom Parker Bowles. The key had been issued to Tom temporarily when he was helping his mother catalog some of Queen Elizabeth's personal effects for a private memorial album. The project had been completed months ago, but no one had asked for the key back. It was an oversight that now looked damning. Mitchell shook his head in frustration. How had they let this happen? At 8 o'clock, Tom was brought to a formal interview room. Present were 2 Metropolitan Police detectives who had been quietly brought in to assist with the investigation. The palace wanted to handle this matter privately if possible, but the involvement of law enforcement was now necessary. Detective Inspector Richard Barnes, a veteran investigator with 20 years of experience, led the questioning. Tom repeated his story. He had been at the palace on Monday to pick up some papers from his office. He had not gone near the Queen's memorial room. He had not taken any jewelry. He had no idea how the items ended up in that storage closet. When asked about the key, Tom admitted he still had it. He pulled it from his pocket, a small brass key on a simple ring. He had forgotten to return it and kept it with his other keys out of habit. Detective Barnes studied Tom carefully. The man seemed genuinely confused and distressed. His body language showed no signs of deception, but the evidence was circumstantial and could not be ignored. Barnes asked about Tom's financial situation. Were there any money problems? Any gambling debts or business difficulties? Tom shook his head. His career was successful. His books sold well. He had no financial problems whatsoever. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla requested a private meeting with the king. They met in the king's study, away from the chaos of the investigation. Camilla was visibly shaken. She knew her son. She knew he was incapable of such a crime, but she also understood the position they were in. The evidence pointed to Tom, and they could not simply ignore it because of family loyalty. The monarchy itself was at stake. King Charles listened to his wife with sympathy and concern. He had known Tom for decades and found it hard to believe he could be guilty. But as king, he had responsibilities that went beyond personal feelings. The crown jewels and royal collection were national treasures. Any theft from the palace was a serious matter that could not be swept under the carpet. They agreed that the investigation must continue wherever it led. By midday, word of the investigation had begun to leak within the palace. Staff members exchanged nervous glances in hallways. Rumors spread quickly, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some said Tom had been arrested. Others claimed the entire royal family was being questioned. The truth was complex enough without embellishment, but palace life thrived on gossip and speculation. Margaret Chen received a call from the head curator, Dr. Elizabeth Morton. Morton had been reviewing inventory records and noticed something odd. 3 months ago, there had been a minor discrepancy in the records for Queen Elizabeth's jewelry collection. A routine audit had shown one item out of place, but when Morton had gone to physically check, everything seemed fine. She had attributed it to a clerical error and corrected the paperwork. Now she wondered if it had been something more. Chen asked Morton to come to the security office immediately. When the curator arrived, she brought the old inventory records with her. Together they compared dates and access logs. The discrepancy had occurred around the same time that several staff members had been given special access to the royal collection for a planned exhibition. Chen's eyes widened as she read the list of names. Among them was a conservation assistant named David Fletcher. Fletcher had worked at the palace for 2 years. He was quiet, efficient, and had excellent references. But Chen noticed something in his file that made her pause. Fletcher had resigned from his position just 2 weeks ago, citing personal reasons. He had left without serving his full notice period, which was unusual but not unheard of. Chen immediately ordered a background check and asked for Fletcher's last known address. The investigation suddenly had a new direction. While Tom remained under suspicion, there was now another possibility to explore. Could Fletcher have stolen the jewelry and somehow planted it to implicate Tom? But why would he do that? What connection could there possibly be between a conservation assistant and the Queen's son? Chen knew they needed answers quickly. Every hour that passed made the situation more volatile. That evening, 2 officers were sent to Fletcher's apartment in South London. They knocked on the door repeatedly, but there was no answer. The landlord was contacted and agreed to let them inside. The apartment was nearly empty. Fletcher had clearly left in a hurry. A few pieces of furniture remained, but personal belongings were gone. On the kitchen counter, officers found a receipt from a pawn shop dated 1 week ago. The pawn shop was visited immediately. The owner, a cautious man named Mr. Singh, remembered Fletcher. He had come in with several items of jewelry, claiming they were family heirlooms he needed to sell quickly. Singh had been suspicious because the items looked expensive, but Fletcher had paperwork that seemed legitimate. Singh had bought them and still had 2 pieces in his shop. When shown photographs, he confirmed they were from the royal collection, items that had not even been reported missing yet. Back at the palace, this news changed everything. Tom Parker Bowles was no longer the prime suspect. The focus shifted entirely to finding David Fletcher. But questions remained. How had Fletcher managed to steal multiple items over several months without detection? Why had he left some items in Tom's storage area? And most urgently, where was he now? The palace turmoil continued, but now with a new direction and renewed hope that the truth would finally emerge. The search for David Fletcher intensified as Wednesday morning arrived. Detective Inspector Barnes coordinated with metropolitan police units across London, issuing alerts and checking transportation hubs. Fletcher had seemingly vanished, but Barnes knew that nobody could disappear completely in the modern world. There would be a trail, however faint. At Buckingham Palace, Tom Parker Bowles was finally allowed to leave, though he remained a person of interest in the investigation. Queen Camilla met him in a private sitting room, embracing her son tightly. They sat together for nearly an hour, talking quietly. Tom was angry about the ordeal, but also relieved that the investigation was moving in a new direction. He wanted to help find Fletcher and clear his name completely. Margaret Chen worked with her team to reconstruct Fletcher's movements over the past several months. They pulled security footage from the days when items had gone missing, cross-referencing it with Fletcher's work schedule. A pattern emerged. Fletcher had been present in the palace on every day when inventory discrepancies had been noted. He had legitimate access to the royal collection and knew exactly how to avoid triggering alarms. But the question of why Fletcher had placed some stolen items in Tom's storage area remained unanswered. Chen interviewed other conservation staff members who had worked with Fletcher. Most described him as quiet and professional, though one colleague mentioned that Fletcher had seemed stressed in recent months. He had mentioned financial problems once or twice, complaining about rent increases and cost of living pressures. A junior conservator named Alice Webb provided a crucial piece of information. She remembered Fletcher asking questions about Tom Parker Bowles several months ago. It had seemed innocent at the time, just casual curiosity about the royal family. Fletcher had asked about Tom's office location, his schedule, and whether he visited the palace regularly. Webb had thought nothing of it then, but now it took on sinister significance. The pieces were coming together. Fletcher had systematically stolen items from the collection over several months, selling some at pawn shops to fund what appeared to be gambling debts. When security measures tightened and he sensed discovery was near, he had attempted to frame Tom by planting the most valuable items in an area associated with him. It was a desperate plan, but it had nearly worked. By Thursday afternoon, a break in the case came from an unexpected source. A woman named Christine Palmer contacted the police tip line. She identified herself as Fletcher's ex-girlfriend and said she knew where he might be hiding. Palmer explained that she and Fletcher had dated for 6 months before breaking up 3 weeks ago. The breakup had been caused by Fletcher's increasing financial problems and what Palmer described as obsessive gambling. Palmer told police that Fletcher had mentioned a cousin who owned a small cottage in Sussex. Fletcher had visited the cottage several times during their relationship, describing it as a peaceful retreat. Palmer provided an address, and within an hour, police units were dispatched to the location. The cottage sat at the end of a winding country lane, surrounded by dense woodland. Detective Barnes led a team of 6 officers as they approached carefully. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was inside. Barnes knocked on the door and identified himself as police. There was a long silence, then the sound of footsteps. David Fletcher opened the door slowly. He looked exhausted, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He was 32 years old with dark hair and a thin frame. When he saw the police, his shoulders sagged in what appeared to be relief. He did not resist or try to run. Instead, he simply stepped aside and invited them in. Inside the cottage, police found evidence of Fletcher's guilt. Several more pieces of jewelry from the royal collection were hidden in a drawer, along with paperwork showing massive gambling debts totaling over £80,000. Fletcher had been using online betting sites for nearly 2 years, spiraling deeper into debt despite his steady income at the palace. At the local police station, Fletcher gave a full confession. He explained how he had started with small thefts, items he thought might not be missed immediately. He sold them at various pawn shops across London, always using fake identification. The money went straight to his gambling debts, but it was never enough. The debts kept growing and loan sharks were threatening him. Fletcher described the planning that went into his crimes. He had studied the security systems, learned the patrol schedules, and identified blind spots in camera coverage. His position as a conservation assistant gave him legitimate reasons to access the collection. He had even obtained duplicate keys by borrowing originals briefly and having copies made at a local locksmith. When asked about Tom Parker Bowles, Fletcher showed genuine remorse. He admitted that planting the jewelry in Tom's storage area had been a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion. He had noticed Tom's occasional visits to the palace and learned about his office location. The storage closet was nearby and rarely used. Fletcher had hoped that if the jewelry were found there, investigators would focus on Tom while Fletcher quietly disappeared. Detective Barnes asked why Fletcher had not simply fled abroad with the stolen jewelry. Fletcher explained that most of it had already been sold to pay debts. The pieces found in the storage closet were the most valuable items he had taken, and he had been planning to sell them through a contact in Amsterdam. But his nerve had failed him at the last moment. The weight of his crimes had become unbearable, The confession was recorded and signed. Fletcher would be charged with multiple counts of theft, fraud, and attempting to pervert the course of justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His career was destroyed and he faced a substantial prison sentence. But in providing a full confession, he had at least spared others from further suspicion. Back at Buckingham Palace, news of Fletcher's arrest brought relief but also raised uncomfortable questions. How had one employee managed to steal from the royal collection over several months without detection? What failures in security protocols had allowed this to happen? King Charles ordered a complete review of palace security systems and inventory procedures. Margaret Chen submitted her preliminary report that evening. She identified several weaknesses in the current system. Key control procedures were inadequate. Security camera coverage had blind spots. Inventory checks were not frequent enough. Staff background checks, while thorough initially, were not regularly updated. Chen recommended a comprehensive overhaul of security measures, which the king immediately approved. Tom Parker Bowles received an official apology from the palace and the Metropolitan Police. While he had never been formally charged, the suspicion cast upon him had been deeply distressing. He accepted the apology gracefully, but told friends privately that the experience had been traumatic. His relationship with the palace would never quite be the same. As Friday dawned, the immediate crisis was over. Fletcher was in custody, confessing to his crimes. The stolen jewelry had been recovered and would be returned to the royal collection. But the palace knew that the real challenge was yet to come. News of the scandal would inevitably leak to the press, and when it did, the royal family would face intense public scrutiny and criticism. The turmoil was far from over. The story broke on Saturday morning when a tabloid newspaper published a front-page exclusive with the headline, "Palace Jewel Thief Caught." The article contained detailed information about the theft, Fletcher's arrest, and the brief period when Tom Parker Bowles had been under suspicion. Within hours, every major news outlet in Britain and around the world was covering the story. The palace communications team went into crisis mode. They had prepared a carefully worded statement acknowledging that items from the royal collection had been stolen by a former employee who was now in police custody. The statement emphasized that all items had been recovered and thanked the Metropolitan Police for their swift action. It made no mention of Tom Parker Bowles or the complications of the investigation, but reporters were not satisfied with the official statement. They dug deeper, finding sources within the palace who revealed that Tom had been questioned extensively. Some newspapers suggested he had been arrested, though this was not true. Others reported that Queen Camilla had demanded special treatment for her son, a claim that had no basis in fact. The story was spiraling beyond the palace's control. Tom Parker Bowles found himself besieged by journalists outside his London home. Camera crews camped on his street. Reporters shouted questions whenever he appeared. His children were followed on their way to school. The intrusion was overwhelming and frightening. Tom released a brief statement through his lawyer, confirming he had assisted police with their inquiries and had been fully exonerated. He asked for privacy for his family. Public reaction was mixed. Many people expressed sympathy for Tom and anger at the media harassment he was experiencing. Others questioned why he had been suspected in the first place and whether his family connection had influenced the investigation. Online forums and social media platforms exploded with debate. The hashtag #PalaceScandalUK trended worldwide. Critics of the monarchy seized on the incident as evidence of palace incompetence. How could valuable historical items be stolen over several months without anyone noticing? Why were security measures so lax? Some commentators suggested that the entire royal household needed reform. Republican groups called for greater accountability and transparency in palace operations. Supporters of the royal family defended the institution, pointing out that theft can occur anywhere, and that the palace had acted swiftly once the crime was discovered. They praised the security team for solving the case quickly and recovering the stolen items. Conservative newspapers published editorials supporting King Charles and Queen Camilla, describing them as victims of criminal activity. Inside the palace, the pressure was intense. Staff members were instructed not to speak to journalists under any circumstances. Security was tightened around all entrances. The king's private secretary held daily meetings to coordinate the palace response to the evolving media crisis. Queen Camilla appeared at scheduled public engagements, maintaining her composure despite the stress. On Monday, the palace made a significant decision. They would hold a press conference to address the situation directly. This was unusual, as the palace typically avoided detailed public discussions of security matters. But the communications team argued that transparency was necessary to stop the speculation and restore public confidence. King Charles approved the plan. The press conference was held on Tuesday afternoon in one of the palace's formal reception rooms. Margaret Chen, the head of palace security, sat at a table alongside a senior palace official and Detective Inspector Barnes. Over 50 journalists filled the room, cameras recording every moment. Chen read a prepared statement explaining the timeline of events, the investigation process, and the recovery of stolen items. Questions came rapidly. How many items had been stolen? Why had it taken months to detect the thefts? What changes would be made to security protocols? Chen answered carefully, providing facts without compromising ongoing security measures. She acknowledged that procedures had failed and assured the public that comprehensive reforms were being implemented. When asked about Tom Parker Bowles, Chen was clear and direct. He had been questioned as part of a thorough investigation because evidence had been found in an area associated with him. However, he was never a suspect in the true sense and had cooperated fully. As soon as Fletcher became the focus of the investigation, Tom was completely cleared. Chen expressed regret that his involvement had become public knowledge. Detective Inspector Barnes confirmed Chen's account, adding that the Metropolitan Police had found no evidence whatsoever linking Tom to the thefts. The jewelry had clearly been planted in an attempt to frame him. Barnes praised the palace security team for their professionalism and thoroughness in handling a complex case. The press conference lasted 90 minutes. While it did not satisfy every question, it provided enough information to change the media narrative. News reports began focusing more on Fletcher's gambling addiction and the systemic issues that enabled his crimes, rather than on speculation about the royal family. This was exactly what the palace had hoped to achieve. David Fletcher appeared in court that week, charged formally with theft and related offenses. He did not contest the charges and was remanded in custody pending sentencing. His lawyer indicated that Fletcher would plead guilty at the formal hearing. The courtroom was packed with journalists, but Fletcher kept his eyes down and said nothing beyond confirming his name and understanding the charges. Public interest remained high, but the initial frenzy began to subside. Opinion polls showed that most British people did not blame the royal family for the thefts. A majority believed the palace had handled the situation appropriately once the crime was discovered. However, there was significant concern about security procedures and calls for greater oversight of palace operations. The Treasury announced that an independent review of royal household security would be conducted. This was partly to reassure the public, but also to address genuine concerns about protecting national heritage. The reviewer would have full access to palace records and security systems, with findings to be published in 6 months. The palace accepted this arrangement without objection. Tom Parker Bowles gradually emerged from the ordeal. He gave one interview to a respected journalist, describing the trauma of being suspected and the relief of exoneration. He spoke eloquently about the presumption of innocence and the damage that can be done by premature judgment. The interview was widely praised and helped restore his public image. Queen Camilla released a personal statement expressing her gratitude to everyone who had supported her son during a difficult time. She acknowledged the stress the incident had caused her family, but affirmed her confidence in the palace security team and the police. The statement was brief but heartfelt, reminding the public that members of the royal family are human beings who feel pain and worry like anyone else. As the second week after the discovery came to a close, the media frenzy finally began to ease. News cycles moved on to other stories. The palace could breathe again, though everyone knew that the aftermath would continue for months. Fletcher still had to be sentenced. The security review would take time, and the reputation of the royal household, while not destroyed, had certainly been damaged. The scandal had erupted, dominated headlines, and now slowly faded, leaving behind lessons and changes that would reshape palace operations for years to come. 3 weeks after David Fletcher's arrest, the investigation entered a new phase as detectives uncovered the full extent of his criminal network. The pawnshops where Fletcher had sold stolen jewelry were thoroughly investigated. Mr. Singh, The shop owner, who had purchased several items, cooperated fully with police and provided detailed records of all transactions with Fletcher. These records revealed something unexpected. Fletcher had not worked entirely alone. A man named Marcus Reed had accompanied Fletcher to the pawnshop on 2 occasions, acting as a witness to validate Fletcher's claims that the jewelry was legitimately his to sell. Reed was tracked down to a flat in East London and arrested. During questioning, he admitted to knowing the jewelry was stolen but claimed he had been coerced by Fletcher, who owed him money. Reed explained that he had lent Fletcher £5,000 for gambling debts. When Fletcher could not repay, he offered Reed a cut of the profits from selling stolen items. Reed, struggling financially himself, had reluctantly agreed. He had not stolen anything himself, but had helped facilitate the sales. His involvement made him an accessory to the crimes, and he too would face charges. Meanwhile, forensic accountants examined Fletcher's financial records in detail. The picture that emerged was tragic. Fletcher had been a capable professional earning a decent salary at the palace, but his gambling addiction had destroyed everything. He had started betting small amounts online 3 years ago, winning occasionally and believing he could control his habit. The addiction escalated rapidly. Fletcher began placing larger bets, chasing losses with desperate wagers. He maxed out credit cards, took out personal loans, and borrowed from friends. When legitimate sources of money dried up, he turned to loan sharks who charged extortionate interest rates. By the time he started stealing from the royal collection, he owed over £80,000 to various creditors. Psychologists brought in to assess Fletcher described a classic pattern of gambling addiction. The thrill of betting had triggered dopamine responses in his brain, creating a compulsion he could not control without help. His intelligence and education had not protected him from this disease. If anything, they had made it easier for him to rationalize his behavior and hide his problems from others. Fletcher's family was devastated by the revelations. His parents, retired teachers living in Cornwall, had no idea their son had been struggling. They had last seen him at Christmas, when he seemed happy and successful. His sister, who lived in Scotland, told reporters that Fletcher had always been the responsible one in the family, the person everyone relied on. The news of his crimes had shocked her to the core. At Buckingham Palace, the security review was proceeding with urgency. A team of experts examined every aspect of the protection systems for the royal collection. They identified multiple weaknesses that had allowed Fletcher's crimes to go undetected for so long. The inventory system was outdated and relied too heavily on manual checks. Key control procedures were poorly documented. Staff supervision was insufficient. Margaret Chen worked closely with the review team, providing detailed information about current procedures and accepting criticism where it was warranted. She had been head of security for 5 years and took personal responsibility for the failures. She offered her resignation to King Charles, but he refused it, saying that fixing the problems was more important than assigning blame. Chen was grateful for the trust but determined to ensure such failures never happened again. New security measures were implemented immediately. A digital inventory system was installed, with each item in the royal collection tagged and tracked electronically. All staff with access to valuable items underwent enhanced background checks and regular reviews. Key control became much stricter, with all keys logged and accounted for daily. Security cameras were upgraded and expanded to eliminate blind spots. The palace also established a new position of collection security officer, reporting directly to Chen and responsible specifically for protecting historical items. Dr. Elizabeth Morton, the head curator, worked closely with this new officer to develop protocols that balanced security needs with the practical requirements of conservation and research work. Tom Parker Bowles slowly returned to normal life. The experience had changed him in subtle ways. He was more cautious about his public profile and more protective of his privacy. He declined several lucrative media offers to tell his story in detail, preferring to move on rather than dwell on the ordeal. His relationship with Queen Camilla remained strong, though both acknowledged the trauma they had shared. In early November, David Fletcher appeared in court for sentencing. He had pleaded guilty to all charges, and his lawyer presented a strong case for mitigation. Fletcher's gambling addiction was documented by medical experts. Character witnesses, including his former supervisors at the palace, testified that he had been a skilled and dedicated employee before his addiction took control. His genuine remorse was evident to everyone in the courtroom. The judge acknowledged these factors but emphasized the seriousness of the crimes. Fletcher had betrayed a position of trust, stolen items of immense historical and sentimental value, and attempted to frame an innocent person. The judge sentenced Fletcher to 4 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years if he successfully completed treatment for his gambling addiction. Marcus Reed received a shorter sentence of 18 months for his role as an accessory. The judge noted that Reed had not stolen anything himself and had been under financial pressure from Fletcher. However, he had knowingly facilitated the disposal of stolen goods, which warranted punishment. Reed accepted the sentence without appeal. The stolen jewelry was formally returned to the royal collection in a small ceremony attended by King Charles, Queen Camilla, and senior palace staff. The items were examined by conservation experts to ensure they had not been damaged. Dr. Morton placed them carefully back into their display cases, now secured with the new electronic monitoring system. It was a moment of closure, though everyone present knew the emotional scars would take longer to heal. Queen Elizabeth's jewelry collection held deep sentimental value for the royal family. Each piece represented a moment in her long life and reign. The diamond brooch had been worn on her wedding day. The pearl necklace was a gift from Queen Mary. The sapphire ring had graced her hand at her coronation. Their temporary loss had felt like a violation of her memory. Their return brought profound relief. As November progressed, media interest in the scandal finally waned. News organizations moved on to other stories. The palace turmoil that had dominated headlines for weeks became yesterday's news. But within the walls of Buckingham Palace, the impact continued. The incident had exposed vulnerabilities and forced difficult conversations about security, trust, and the challenges of protecting a historic institution in the modern world. Staff meetings were held to discuss the lessons learned. Employees were encouraged to report concerns about colleagues who might be struggling with financial or personal problems. Support services were enhanced, including confidential counseling and financial advice. The palace recognized that preventing future crimes required not just better security systems, but also better care for the people who worked within them. The Independent Security Review concluded its initial phase and published preliminary findings. The report praised the swift response once the theft was discovered, but criticized the lack of preventive measures. It made 37 specific recommendations, all of which the palace committed to implementing within 6 months. The comprehensive final report would follow, but the early action demonstrated the palace's determination to change. For Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla, and everyone affected by the scandal, life gradually returned to something resembling normalcy. The wounds were healing, though scars remained. The truth had emerged through diligent investigation and careful analysis. David Fletcher's crimes had been exposed, justice had been served, and the royal collection was secure once again. The palace turmoil had tested the institution, but it had survived, stronger and more vigilant than before. 6 months after the scandal first erupted, Buckingham Palace looked much the same from the outside. Tourists still gathered at the gates to watch the changing of the guard. The Union Jack flew proudly above the building, but inside everything had changed in subtle yet profound ways. The palace had learned difficult lessons and emerged transformed. The comprehensive security review was published in March, receiving widespread attention from media and historians. The report detailed exactly how David Fletcher had exploited weaknesses in palace procedures over several months. It praised the eventual response but criticized the culture that had allowed such vulnerabilities to exist. The recommendations were extensive, and the palace accepted all of them without reservation. Margaret Chen oversaw the implementation of these changes with determination. Every recommendation was tracked and documented. New staff were hired, including technology specialists who installed cutting-edge security systems. The inventory process was completely modernized, with every item in the royal collection now monitored in real time. Any unauthorized movement triggered immediate alerts to the security control room. Staff training programs were enhanced dramatically. New employees underwent comprehensive security awareness courses. Existing staff attended regular refresher sessions. Everyone learned to recognize warning signs of colleagues in distress, whether from financial problems, addiction, or personal crises. The palace established confidential support services, including counseling and financial advice, available to all employees without judgment. King Charles took a personal interest in these reforms. He held meetings with Chen and other security officials every month, reviewing progress and asking detailed questions. He understood that protecting the royal collection was not just about preventing theft. It was about preserving national heritage for future generations and maintaining public trust in the monarchy itself. Queen Camilla also played an active role in the aftermath. She visited staff areas regularly, talking to employees and thanking them for their dedication. She knew that morale had been damaged by the scandal and the intense scrutiny that followed. Her presence and genuine interest in people's well-being helped heal those wounds. The Queen had always been good at connecting with ordinary people, and she used that gift generously during this difficult period. Tom Parker Bowles had largely withdrawn from public life for several months, focusing on his family and his work. He published a new cookbook in April, which received excellent reviews and strong sales. The scandal was barely mentioned in media coverage of the book launch, a sign that public attention had finally moved on. Tom gave interviews about food and cooking, carefully avoiding any discussion of the previous year's ordeal. In private conversations with friends, Tom admitted that the experience had changed his perspective on fame and public life. He was grateful for his career success but also recognized the dangers of being associated with the royal family. The constant media attention, the invasion of privacy, and the assumption of guilt had been traumatic. He told his mother that he would be more careful about his public profile going forward. David Fletcher served his sentence in a medium-security prison. He participated fully in addiction treatment programs and showed genuine progress in understanding his gambling compulsion. Prison psychologists reported that he expressed deep remorse for his crimes and the harm he had caused. He wrote letters of apology to the royal family, though these were not made public. Whether those apologies would ever be read or acknowledged remained unclear. Fletcher's case became a subject of discussion in addiction treatment circles. His story illustrated how gambling addiction could destroy lives regardless of intelligence, education, or social status. Advocacy groups used his example to call for better support services and stronger regulation of online gambling platforms. Some good came from the tragedy, as awareness of gambling addiction increased significantly. Marcus Reed, the accomplice, was released from prison after serving 10 months of his 18-month sentence. He immediately moved away from London, returning to his hometown in Wales. He found work in construction and kept a low profile, trying to rebuild his life away from the mistakes that had led to his conviction. He never spoke publicly about the case, determined to put it behind him. At the palace, the display case that had held Queen Elizabeth's stolen jewelry was rededicated in a private ceremony. A small plaque was added noting that the items had been recovered after a theft in the previous year. This acknowledgement of the incident was deliberate. The palace did not want to hide its history, even the difficult parts. Transparency and honesty, they believed, were essential to maintaining public trust. Public opinion surveys showed that the scandal had not significantly damaged the monarchy's overall popularity. Most British people understood that crimes could occur anywhere, and appreciated that the palace had responded decisively. The reforms and increased transparency were viewed positively. If anything, the incident had made the royal family seem more human and relatable. Facing challenges like any other institution, Republican groups who had hoped to use the scandal to advance their cause found little public appetite for abolishing the monarchy. The Queen's jewels had been stolen and recovered. Reforms had been implemented. Justice had been served. Most people were ready to move on. The constitutional debate about monarchy versus republic continued, but was not significantly influenced by this particular incident. For historians and security experts, the case became a valuable case study. Universities and training institutions used it to teach about institutional security, risk management, and crisis response. The palace's eventual transparency was praised, though the initial vulnerabilities were criticized. Fletcher's detailed confession provided insights into how intelligent criminals could exploit trusted positions, lessons relevant far beyond palace walls. As spring turned to summer, life at Buckingham Palace continued its ancient rhythms. State banquets were held, Investiture ceremonies honored citizens for their achievements. Garden parties celebrated community service. The daily work of monarchy went on, now undergirded by stronger security systems and better staff support. The scandal had been a crisis, but it had also been an opportunity for improvement. Captain James Mitchell, the guard who had first discovered the open display case, was commended for his diligence and attention to detail. He continued his work with pride, knowing that his vigilance had prevented even greater losses. Officer Sarah Williams, who found the planted jewelry, received a promotion. Both became symbols within the palace of doing one's duty, regardless of the personal or political implications. Margaret Chen reflected on the entire episode in her annual security report to the king. She noted that no security system could be completely foolproof. Human beings were fallible, and determined criminals could sometimes exploit that reality, but institutions could learn, adapt, and improve. The palace had done exactly that. The question now was whether these hard-won lessons would be remembered and applied consistently in the years ahead. For the royal family, the scandal was now part of their history, neither hidden nor dwelt upon. Queen Elizabeth's jewelry collection remained on display, protected by sophisticated security that honored her memory, while ensuring her treasures would be preserved for future generations. The turmoil had passed, leaving behind a stronger institution and important lessons about trust, vulnerability, and the constant need for vigilance. As another Tuesday morning dawned over London, sunlight streamed through the palace windows just as it had on that fateful day when the theft was discovered. But now, security officers monitored their upgraded systems with confidence. Staff worked with renewed awareness of their responsibilities. The royal collection was safer than it had been in decades. The scandal had tested the palace severely, but in the end, the ancient institution had proven resilient enough to face modern challenges, learn from mistakes, and emerge stronger. The turmoil was over, but the lessons would endure.